My name is Margaret Elaine Voss, and I want to tell you about a Tuesday morning in March when a 34-year-old man in a very expensive blazer slid a piece of paper across a conference room table and told me my 11 years meant nothing. He did not say it that way, of course. He never would. People like Derek Callum do not say the ugly thing out loud. They dress it up. They use words like restructuring and transition and the next phase of growth. He used the word transition 4 times in under 10 minutes. I counted. I had nothing else to do. I was not really part of the conversation. I was just the person it was happening to. The conference room was on the 14th floor, glass walls on 2 sides. I had been in that room hundreds of times. I had presented in that room. I had fought for budget in that room. I had once spent 3 hours in that room explaining to a room full of investors why our platform could handle the load they were about to put on it. I was right, by the way. It handled it fine. Because I built it to. That morning, the room felt different. Smaller somehow. There were 3 people across from me. Derek, the HR director, a woman named Paula who kept her hands folded on top of a manila folder like she was holding it down, and a 3rd person I had never seen before, someone from legal, I assumed, because she did not introduce herself and did not speak once. Derek spoke. Paula nodded. The legal woman looked at her phone. Derek told me the company was moving in a new direction. He told me my role was being eliminated as part of a broader restructuring effort. He told me this was not a reflection of my contributions. He said the word transition again, and I remember thinking, he has practiced this. He has stood in front of a mirror somewhere and practiced this exact sentence so that it comes out smooth. Then, he slid the paper across the table. Severance terms. 2 months of pay, health insurance through the end of the quarter. A line at the bottom that said I agreed not to disparage the company or discuss the terms with outside parties. I did not look at it right away. I looked at the box. It was sitting on the edge of the table, right next to Derek's arm. A standard brown cardboard box. Not big. My whole 11 years apparently fit inside something you could carry with one hand. I could see the small green leaves of my succulent plant poking up over the top. I could see the corner of my external hard drive. My badge was sitting on top of everything, face up, with my photo looking back at me. Someone had packed that box before I walked in, before I sat down, before Derek said a single word. While I was still in the elevator, coming up to what I thought was a regular Tuesday morning meeting, someone was already on my side of the building, going through my desk, putting my things in a box. I had not said yes yet. I had not agreed to anything. They had already decided I was gone. I sat there, and I did not cry. I want you to know that. Not because I was not hurt. I was. But I had spent 11 years in rooms full of men who were waiting for me to show weakness, and I was not going to give this particular room that satisfaction. I was 51 years old. I was the only income in my house. My daughter was finishing her junior year of college, and her tuition bill came every semester, whether Arcion Systems valued me or not. I had a mortgage. I had a car payment. I had a life that required me to keep it together for exactly as long as it took to get out of that room. So I picked up the pen. I signed the paper. I picked up the box, and Derek Callum, who had been at Arcion Systems for 19 months, watched me walk to the elevator without saying another word. The platform I built processes over $2 billion in client transactions every year. He did not build one line of it. I want to explain what Arcion actually does, because it matters. It matters for everything that comes later. When I joined the company in 2013, it was small, fewer than 80 people. The kind of office where you know everyone's coffee order and the kitchen runs out of paper towels every other week. The product was a logistics and supply chain management platform, which sounds complicated, but the idea behind it is simple. Imagine you are a large retailer. You have warehouses, freight carriers, and dozens of manufacturers sending you products every week. Things are moving constantly. A truck is late. A supplier runs out of stock. A storm shuts down a regional hub. In the old way, a human being would have to notice the problem, make calls, find a solution, and update everyone. That process could take hours, sometimes days. And in supply chain management, hours cost money. Days cost contracts. What Arcion's platform does is watch all of that in real time and respond automatically. When a shipment is delayed, the system finds the next best route without anyone asking it to. When a supplier signals a shortage, the platform adjusts the purchase order before the warehouse even knows there is a problem. When inventory numbers shift on the retail side, the system recalculates what is needed and where, and it does it quietly, in the background, while everyone else is still drinking their morning coffee. That is the product. That is what it does. And when I arrived in 2013, it mostly did not work. The architecture was patched together. The system crashed under load. We lost data during high traffic periods. We had clients who were nervous and a leadership team that was running out of time to fix it before they lost those clients entirely. I was hired as a senior infrastructure architect, which meant I was hired to solve that problem. It took 3 years of going deep into the structure of how the platform moved data, where it failed, why it failed, and what it needed to stop failing. I made decisions during those years that are now invisible inside the system. The way data is segmented across the network. The way the platform handles a failed connection from a freight carrier without dropping everything that depends on it. The way it scales during peak periods without the client ever feeling a slowdown. Those decisions are baked into the code so deeply that most of the current engineering team does not even know they are there. They just know the system works. They do not always know why. In 2015, we almost lost our largest client. There was a system failure during a major onboarding migration, the kind of thing that happens at 2 a.m. on a Friday and gets worse every hour you do not fix it. I rewrote a critical data routing layer over that weekend. By Sunday night, the system was stable. By Monday morning, the client never knew how close it had come to collapsing. The CTO at the time, a man named Gerald, called me into his office that week. He told me that weekend had saved the company's biggest contract. He told me the company owed me. I got a thank you email. I trained every engineer who worked on that platform after me. I wrote the internal documentation. I made the calls with clients when things went wrong, and the technical explanation needed someone who actually understood what had happened. I was the connective tissue between what the platform was and what it could become. None of that was in my job title. And none of that was in the box they handed me on a Tuesday morning in March. I need to tell you about Derek, because this story does not make sense without him. He arrived at Arcion 18 months before they let me go. He came in with a title, Vice President of Product and Strategy, and an introduction email from the new CEO that used the phrase visionary leader twice. His name was Vincent Hale. Vincent had been brought in by a private equity group that had purchased a controlling stake in Arcion about 2 years prior. Vincent was the kind of CEO who talked about unlocking value and accelerating the roadmap. He wore his shirt untucked in all-hands meetings because it made him look relaxed. He was not relaxed. He was in a hurry. And Derek was the person he brought in to move things faster. Derek had an MBA from a school whose name opens doors. He had worked at 2 other tech companies before Arcion, neither of which I could find much real product history for when I looked. He had 14,000 followers on LinkedIn. His posts got hundreds of likes, the kind of posts that say things like the best technology is invisible and great platforms don't just solve problems, they anticipate them. People shared those posts. I read them sometimes and thought about the years I had spent making our platform invisible in exactly the way he was describing, and I wondered if he had ever actually done that for anything. He had not built anything. Not that I could find. Not that anyone at Arcion could point to. But he was very good at something I was not. He was good at making other people's work sound like his thinking. The first time I noticed it was in a board presentation about 6 weeks after he arrived. I had put together a detailed technical brief on a proposed infrastructure upgrade, something I had been planning for months. Derek took that brief, removed most of the technical detail, added 3 slides with clean graphics, and presented it to the board as part of his strategic platform vision. He did not mention my name. The board loved it. Vincent nodded along like Derek had just invented something. I told myself it was fine. That is what executives do. They translate technical work into business language. I understood that. But then it kept happening. My team's work packaged and presented as Derek's direction. Roadmap decisions I had already made, reframed as his initiatives. And slowly, quietly, I started disappearing from the rooms where those conversations happened. A product roadmap meeting I had attended every quarter for 6 years, I stopped receiving the calendar invite. When I asked about it, I was told the meeting had been restructured for senior leadership alignment. I went to the new CTO, a man named Brian who had also come in with Vincent's team, and I told him what I was seeing. I told him I was being cut out of decisions that directly affected systems I had built. He listened. He nodded. And then he told me to stay in my lane. That phrase. I have thought about it many times since. Stay in your lane. As if the lane I was in had not been the entire road before Derek Callum showed up and decided to drive on it, I went back to my desk. I kept working. That was the only thing I knew how to do. There are things I never said out loud while I was at Arcion. Things I absorbed and filed away and told myself were just the cost of being where I was. I want to talk about them now, because they are part of the story whether I am comfortable with them or not. About 3 years before my firing, I found out what one of my team members was making. It was not intentional. He left a pay stub on the shared printer, the kind of mistake anyone can make. I saw it before I realized what it was, and by the time I understood, I had already seen the number. He was 29 years old. He had been at Arcion for 2 years. He was a good engineer, solid, reliable, someone I had helped train. He was making $22,000 more per year than I was. I had been at the company for 8 years at that point. I was running architecture decisions that affected the entire platform. I was the person clients called when something broke. I was the person leadership leaned on when a major contract was at risk. $22,000 more per year. I went to HR. I asked, as calmly as I could, about the salary structure for my role and how compensation decisions were made at my level. Paula, the same Paula who would later sit across from me with her hands folded on that manila folder, told me that discrepancies like the one I was describing were typically the result of market rate adjustments at the time of hire. She said the company regularly reviewed compensation. She said she would look into it. I never heard back. And I did not push it. I did not push it because my daughter had just started high school. Because my husband had left 2 years before that, and I was the only income coming into our house. because I had a mortgage and a car and a child who was going to need college tuition in 4 years, because I had watched other women push back at Arcion and get labeled as difficult, and I had seen what happened to difficult women when the next round of budget cuts came around. So I stayed quiet. And I kept taking on more. Every year, my actual responsibilities grew wider. I never got a new title to match. I went from senior architect to principal architect eventually, but the scope of what I was doing had long since outgrown any title they gave me. I was handling vendor contract reviews. I was the point of contact for compliance documentation that no one else understood well enough to produce. I was joining client onboarding calls that were not technically part of my job description, because when those calls got technical, the account managers needed someone who could actually answer the questions. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, in 2018, I built something that I need you to understand. I called it the dependency bridge. It is a routing module, a piece of the platform that manages how our system connects and communicates with a client's internal software. Every enterprise client has their own internal tech stack, their own data formats, their own connection protocols. The dependency bridge is what makes Arcion's platform speak their language. Without it, the platform cannot exchange data with the client's systems. Without it, the whole connection goes silent. By the time I was let go, the dependency bridge was the live connection point for 11 of Arcion's 14 enterprise clients. I had never fully documented how it worked. Not because I was hiding anything, I simply never had time, and no one ever asked. It lived mostly in my head, built layer by layer over years of late nights and client-specific adjustments that I handled alone because I was the only one who knew how. I did not think about that when I signed the severance paper, but I would think about it soon. I drove home from Arcion Systems on that Tuesday afternoon with the brown cardboard box in my back seat and my succulent plant riding next to it, like a small, quiet passenger. I took the long way. Not on purpose, I just missed my turn and did not feel like correcting it. So I drove an extra 15 minutes through streets I did not usually take, past a grocery store and a dry cleaner and a school with kids on the playground, and I thought about nothing in particular because my brain had decided it was not ready to think about anything specific yet. I sat in my driveway for 20 minutes after I parked. Just sat there. The engine off. The box in the back seat, the house in front of me looking exactly the way it always looked, completely unaware that anything had changed. Then I went inside and made dinner. My daughter Claire was coming home from campus that weekend, and I did not want the house to feel wrong when she arrived. I did not want her to walk in and immediately know that something had happened. She was 21 and sharp, and she would have known in 30 seconds. So I cooked. I cleaned the kitchen. I acted like a person who had a normal day. I told her on Saturday morning, over coffee. I kept it simple. I told her the company had made some cuts, and my position was one of them. I told her I was fine. I told her not to worry about school, her tuition was covered through the semester, and I would figure out the rest. She looked at me for a long moment in the way she has done since she was small, like she is reading something just below the surface of what I am saying. Then she said, "Mom, they were idiots." And she hugged me. I held it together until she went back to campus on Sunday. Then I sat down on the kitchen floor for a little while and let myself feel it. The first week after that was very quiet. Arcion did not call. No one from the engineering team reached out. No one from product. No one from the client success team that I had supported for years. I kept expecting someone to ask about the documentation, the vendor relationships, the architecture decisions that existed only in my head and in the code I had written. I expected a call saying, "We just need 30 minutes to go over a few things." That call never came. They believed they had what they needed. They believed the platform would just keep running because it always had. On the 8th day, my phone rang. It was a number I recognized, a client contact. Her name was Carolyn Marsh. She was the VP of Supply Chain Operations at one of Arcion's largest enterprise accounts. We had worked closely for years. She was direct and smart, and she did not call people to make small talk. She told me she had heard I was no longer at Arcion. Then she said, "Margaret, I'm going to be honest with you. We're already seeing small things. Sync delays. A routing lag that wasn't there 3 weeks ago. Is there anyone over there who actually knows how this works?" I told her I could not speak to that. But I got off the phone and I opened my laptop. And I started writing things down. 31 days after they handed me that box, Arcion's platform broke. I did not know the details right away. I learned them piece by piece. The way you learn things when you are no longer inside the building but you still know everyone who is. What I know now is that it started as a routing error. A specific kind of failure in the way the system was distributing connection requests across the network. The kind of thing I caught regularly during my morning system checks. The kind of thing I had built alert logic for years ago. Logic that apparently no one had maintained properly after I left. By midday, it had spread. The system was sending shipment data to the wrong endpoints. Inventory signals were not updating. The platform was telling clients everything was fine while quietly routing their freight information into the wrong queues. By late afternoon, 9 of Arcion's 14 enterprise clients had lost their live data connection entirely. 9 out of 14. 2 of those clients triggered their emergency escalation protocols, formal processes that get activated when a critical vendor fails to meet service-level commitments. One of those clients was a regional grocery distribution network that had been running on Arcion's platform for 4 years. For 4 years, their freight routing had been fully automated. They had not manually called a carrier to confirm a delivery in 4 years. That Tuesday, they spent the evening on the phone doing exactly that, while their operations team tried to figure out where their shipments actually were. I found out none of this from Arcion. At 7:14 in the evening, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was a text from Carolyn Marsh. 3 words. It all broke. I read it twice. Then I set the phone down and stood at my kitchen counter for a moment, looking at the window above the sink. It was dark outside. The light over the stove was on, and the rest of the kitchen was dim and quiet. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I think it matters. I did not feel glad. I want you to understand that clearly. I had spent 11 years caring about that platform. I had spent weekends and late nights and years of my life making sure it did not break. Some part of me had been grieving it since the day I left, the way you grieve something you built with your own hands and then had taken from you. Hearing that it had broken did not feel like victory. It felt like confirmation, cold and quiet and exactly as heavy as I expected. I had known this was possible the moment Derek Callum slid that paper across the table. I had known it the way you know something when you understand a system all the way down to its foundation. The platform did not break because the engineers who remained were incompetent. It broke because there were decisions baked into its structure that no one left at Arcion fully understood. And without someone who understood them, the system was one wrong move away from exactly what had just happened. I did not call Arcion. I did not text anyone on the engineering team. I did not reach out to offer help. Instead, I opened my personal laptop, pulled up the document I had started after Carolyn's first call, and I kept writing. Architecture notes. Decision logic I had never formally documented. The specific sequence of vendor contact protocols that kept the dependency bridge stable during high-load periods, things that lived in my memory and nowhere else. I wrote for 2 hours. Not to give back to Arcion, to protect myself, to make sure that what I knew existed somewhere outside my head in a form I controlled. At 9:30 that evening, my phone rang. It was a recruiter, a man named Paul Garrett, who I had spoken to briefly about 2 years earlier when I was quietly testing the market. He told me he had heard I was available. He told me a company called Veripath had asked him to reach out. Veripath was one of Arcion's most serious competitors in the enterprise logistics space. I told Paul I was listening. 4 days after the outage, my phone rang with a number I recognized immediately. I had dialed that number myself many times over the years, from airport waiting areas, from my car in the parking garage, from my desk at 7 in the morning before most of the building had arrived. I knew Derek Callum's number the way you know the numbers of people you have worked alongside, even when you wish you did not. I let it go to voicemail. I stood in my kitchen and watched the screen and let it ring through. Then I made coffee and waited. When the notification came, I sat down at my kitchen table and listened. His voice was easy, relaxed, almost warm, in the way that people sound when they have decided the best approach is to act like nothing uncomfortable has happened. He said he just wanted to check in and see how I was settling in. He said he hoped I was doing well. Then, after about 30 seconds of that, he got to it. He said the team was working through a few technical questions and thought I might have some useful historical context. He said it would just be a quick conversation. He said the phrase quick conversation twice in under 2 minutes. I listened to the whole message. Then, I listened to it again. I sat with it for a moment after that. Not because I was deciding what to do. I already knew I was not going to call him back. I sat with it because I wanted to fully understand what I was hearing. Derek Callum, the man who had spent 18 months slowly erasing me from every room that mattered, who had presented my work as his vision, who had sat across from me with a packed box already on the table. That man had just called my personal phone to ask if I would help him for free. Casually. Like I would of course say yes. Like 11 years of my loyalty had made me permanently available to the people who had used it up and thrown the rest away. I set the phone face down on the table and finished my coffee. Then I called my attorney. Her name is Dana Reeves, and I had consulted her once before, 2 years earlier, when I was trying to understand my options around the pay gap I had discovered. At the time, she had told me I had a case worth exploring, but that the path would be long and uncertain. I had decided not to pursue it then. I called her now and told her everything: the firing, the severance, the outage, and Derek's voicemail. She listened carefully. Then she told me something I had not considered. The dependency bridge module, the routing system I had built in 2018, had been constructed during a period when my employment contract had lapsed briefly between 2 consecutive agreements. There was a gap of about 6 weeks where I had continued working without a signed contract in place. Dana told me that during that window, the standard IP assignment clauses that would have automatically transferred ownership of my work to Arcion may not have applied cleanly. The question of who actually owned the dependency bridge had never been formally resolved. It had never needed to be. It needed to be now. That same evening, I took the call with Paul Garrett and Veripath. I had told Paul I was listening, and I meant it. The call lasted 90 minutes. I spoke for most of it. I described my background, the platform I had built, the architecture decisions I had made, and why. About an hour in, I noticed that Paul had stopped asking questions. He was just listening. Taking notes, I assumed. Letting me talk. By the time we hung up, they had asked me when I was available to speak with their executive team. There is a specific morning I keep coming back to. It was about 6 weeks after the day they handed me that box. I woke up before my alarm, which I had been doing most mornings since the firing, that restless, too early waking that comes when your mind is carrying something heavy and does not know how to set it down while you sleep. But this morning was different. I lay there in the quiet and I realized the weight had shifted. The anxious, tight feeling that had been sitting in the center of my chest since that Tuesday in March. The feeling of waiting for something terrible to happen, or waiting for someone to fix something, or waiting for the world to notice that a wrong thing had been done. That feeling was gone. Or not gone exactly. Quieter, like a noise that had been running in the background for so long you stopped hearing it, and then one morning you wake up and the house is finally still. Things had moved. Not loudly, not dramatically, but they had moved. Dana had sent a formal letter to Arcion's legal team outlining the IP ownership question around the dependency bridge. She was careful and precise in how she framed it, not as a threat, not as a lawsuit, but as an unresolved legal question that needed to be addressed before Arcion continued deploying and licensing a module whose ownership had never been formally established. The letter cited the contract gap in 2018. It cited the scope of the module. It cited the 11 enterprise clients whose connections ran through it every single day. Arcion's general counsel responded within a week. They wanted to talk. I want to be honest about what the negotiation looked like, because I think people expect it to be more dramatic than it was. There was no courtroom. There was no deposition. There were a few calls between Dana and their legal team, some written exchanges, and a relatively short period of back and forth. What I saw on my end was a company that had made a calculation, that I was a cost they could eliminate, slowly realizing that the calculation had been wrong, that the thing they thought they were letting go of was still attached to something they could not afford to lose. The settlement is something I cannot discuss in full detail. But I can tell you that my severance was significantly increased, and I can tell you that certain licensing terms were established around the dependency bridge that reflected the reality of what I had built and what it was worth. It was not everything I had given Arcion over 11 years. Nothing could have been. But it was recognition. Quiet, legal, financial recognition that the work was real and the value was real and it had belonged, at least in part, to me. 2 weeks after the settlement was finalized, I accepted the offer from Veripath, Vice President of Platform Architecture, a title that reflected what I had actually been doing for years, not what Arcion had been willing to write on paper. I told Claire on a Sunday afternoon. She was home for a long weekend and we were sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where I had listened to Derek's voicemail and set my phone face down and tried to decide what kind of woman I was going to be about all of this. I told her the title and I watched her face. She said, "Mom." Finally. Just that. Finally. And something in me released that I had not known I was still holding. My first day at Veripath, someone met me at the door and handed me a coffee and walked me to a conference room where 4 members of their engineering leadership were already seated. One of them slid a printed architecture diagram across the table, their current platform structure, and said, "We'd love to know what you see." I looked at that diagram. I saw 17 things immediately. And I said so. Nobody told me to stay in my lane. I want to close by saying something simple, because I am not interested in speeches and I do not think you came here for a lesson. But I spent 11 years making myself smaller so that I would be easier to keep. I made myself quiet about the pay gap because I was afraid. I made myself available for every task that was not in my job description because I thought that was how you proved your worth. I thought if I just kept building, kept showing up, kept being indispensable, it would eventually be enough. It was not enough. Not there. Not for those people. The work was always real. The value was always real. The only thing that changed was who finally got to see it.